welcome to the third in our series of videos highlighting the SweetEngine API engine using the Joke API tutorial. So if you remember, this is a series of videos where we'll start off basic and get more complex in learning how to call the Joke API. And eventually at the end of our series, we will have a quote-unquote production version of getting jokes into Business Central. But for right now, we're exploring what we can do without code. In the last video, in our second video, we were constructing the URL to call the API with the API engine's path construction capabilities. But in those, we used what we call static values. In other words, you couldn't change them. In this video, in our third video, we will learn how to construct the path so that they use variables determined at runtime. And then we'll go on from there into our fourth and fifth video. Let's kind of go over the objectives. So our objectives of our third video is one, to create our API variables so that it will construct the URL with values provided at runtime. We're going to introduce the concept of an API parameter, which is essentially where those variable values will be held, waiting for the actual API call. And we'll do that with the user interface versus handling it by coding. And we'll also, as part of that process, explore the lifecycle of an API message. So let's take a look at our BC environment. And if you remember, so these are our API functions that we've defined in the last video. They each do specific things. So this one will retrieve 10 but safe jokes from a random category. This one will only get the 10 jokes from the programming category. This last one will only get a single joke from a random category. And then we defined another API call that would get all the possible categories. And notice in our path construction, we have part of our static path that all these are part of the joke API endpoint, and getting categories is part of the category API endpoint. From each one of these, we essentially define some variables. One, the URL path. So essentially, if you remember, we had our base URL plus this default static path, and then more of a variable path where we're piecing it together. And we essentially said, next, we want to put the value any in the path, and that means we want to get jokes from any category. And then we also added these URL parameters, and we had two of them. One saying that we only wanted safe jokes, which this was a tag that essentially went into query params, and another one that specified we want 10 jokes. So let's see what we can do with this. First of all, let's again review what we can do with some of the utilities. So let's just go ahead and copy this function into a new one. And we'll say we want to put it as part of our existing API set versus move it to a different API set. And we're going to call it get jokes by, say, for category. So our objective here is that based on a runtime category that we're going to provide, we wanted to get 10 jokes. So essentially that was this API that we just copied. This is the new one. And let's change our description. So I guess I need to put it into edit first. Say 10 but safe jokes from a from a category provided at run time. So if you remember the URL, we need, it's got to still be part of the joke path. Okay. And the URL path now we had as a static value to any, and this is what we're going to want to change. So instead of static, we're going to make it, we want it from a parameter record. We don't need this value anymore. We're essentially not hard coding any. And for the sake of not doing any coding at this point in time, as we go further in our video series, we will actually add 2 new tables to our solution. One for joke categories and another one for the actual jokes that we retrieve. But for right now, we need to find something that already exists in BC that we could use as part of our solution. So essentially what we'll do here is choose the item category table. Table 5722, and we'll pick that. And we're going to pull the category that we want from the description field, and I'll go over that in just a little bit. So right now we're saying we want you to pull this from a parameter record when we actually make the API call. And we want it to pull from the item category table, the description field. I'm also going to do one other setting and say, if you can't resolve the variable, we want it to send a standard undefined value. So let's essentially see what happens right now if we try to execute this call. So if we go back home and say execute, we're going to try to reach out to the joke API. And so it essentially did a full cycle execution. It says, do we want to open this message? We will say yes. Now let's look at our request. So essentially, we don't have a category, right, that's in there because we couldn't resolve it at runtime. So we ended up getting an error back from the system. They were essentially saying, okay, they're giving us reasons. The joke API is actually fairly decent in how it reports back to it. Other APIs are a little more cryptic in what's wrong. But in this one, we can tell that, hey, we don't have a category that we told it, and that's required by the joke API. So it failed because we didn't essentially provide it a parameter that resolved the variable that we defined. So how do we go about getting the API parameter in there when we execute the message? To understand, how we're going to get the parameter in there, we need to take a look at a slide first and kind of look at the life cycle of an API call. And from our SuiteEngine API engine's perspective, that's an API message. An API message essentially creates the request, sends the request, retrieves the response, and then initiates the processing of the response. So if you can see in the beginning, when the message is initialized, we are going to specify, well, which API function are we executing? And then we're going to add API parameters to it. Normally, this is done through code, but we can do it through the user interface. And then from that point, it will build the request, send the request, receive a response, and then process the response, both in terms of building what we've seen so far in the data buffer and processing mappings, which we will get in a few videos down the road. So let's take a look at, let's go back to BC. And so how can we get the parameter in there? Normally we've been pressing this execute button, and it's just kind of done the whole thing for us. But it didn't give us the opportunity of specifying the parameter. So what we can do is go to the messages, and we see our last failed message here, and just press the new button. In other words, we're going to create a new request. Since we were already on this API function, it's inserted it. So now if you remember from our slide, we need to specify the function, and then we can add API parameters that we want this message to use in the process of its calls. So that's down here in the parameter section, and we can say add new parameter. And then we're essentially going to add a table record. And we're going to use the item category, the Business Central item category table for now. Remember, we haven't added our joke category table, so we're going to use something that already exists in BC. So let's search for that item category. Table 5722. And you can see that I've already added a programming category here, but actually the BC Kronos database already had a miscellaneous category, and this is actually the code that we need because there is a miscellaneous category in the joke. Now, one of the reasons why I told it to use description instead of the code field is that the code field is always uppercase. It's a code field, so Business Central always forces it to uppercase. And a lot of API calls are case sensitive. So just to be safe, I wanted it to use the description field to say, okay, what do I actually want to send to the joke API? So we'll go ahead and select this one. You can see that we've now added a table record to our API parameter list. Okay. And essentially the key to our parameter is the table number. And then it essentially has, for your technical people, it actually has a record reference to the record that we chose, which is essentially the miscellaneous category. So now we have the parameter in there. What can we do? So we can actually tell it, we can actually do manual processing and step through it a piece at a time. And since part of our objective was to learn the anatomy or the life cycle of an API message, let's just go ahead and do that. So we know which function we're executing. We know the related API message. The next thing we need to do is send. And as part of that, the API call is going to send back its response. So you can see right now our message, first of all, our message says that it's in status response. So that means we've made it that far. We've sent it and we've got a response. And we can see that the response is here. And we essentially have 10 jokes that are all from the category miscellaneous. You can see the request that we made, which includes the path part that tells us that we only want miscellaneous jokes and that we want 10. And we can see, if we counted all these up, we can see that we got 10 jokes. So that's the first step. The next video, we will go over what we call key value parameters. In other words, so maybe a user is going to input how many jokes we want. Right now, we still have our API call fixed at retrieving 10, and we have it fixed at only getting safe mode jokes. So in our next video, we will see so in this one, we saw how we could do a table record, and in the next one, we'll see how we can construct what we call a key value parameter. And remember that everything that we've done so far can be done in code as well to provide a more production solution. So until next time, and thanks for watching.